I'm Eric Alexander, and together with Glenn Gaviola, we're very pleased to be able to discuss with you this e-learning video, which is entitled Qualitative versus Quantitative Approaches to Medical Education Research. Over the next 15 to 20 minutes, we'd like to talk to you about these topics. We really want to outline that there are two approaches to medical education research. They are qualitative and separately quantitative approaches to the same problem. And when we think about the qualitative or quantitative approaches, there are differences in how we think about data collection, data analysis, or interpretation. And hopefully this short video will provide some building blocks for your next project, and we'll also have the chance to review some examples from the current literature. To begin, however, I wanted to talk through why medical education research at times can feel different than typical biomedical research. And the background here, of course, is that most of what we learned before we entered healthcare was grounded in the physical sciences. If we went to medical school, or even before that in undergraduate education, we were often taught about physics, chemistry, biochemistry, geology. And these physical sciences are really grounded in finding the answers. It's a reductionist approach. As we enter more, though, into medical education, we realize that this is more a social science. Topics like education, psychology, anthropology, or a background in sociology often lend you more to understanding how to approach these problems. And social sciences exist because we are not inanimate as people, and learning is complex. And to even make this more complex, we would argue that medicine itself is an applied science or a life science. But the crux of it is this, that most of what we do day to day, treating patients, is grounded more in a mentality that embraces the physical sciences. But when we switch over to doing medical education research, we often are dealing more in a social science arena. And let's kind of talk about the continuum of how we might analyze a specific investigation from different perspectives, talking about how we can move from more of a physical science background to more of a social science approach. So consider this. What if you wanted to study a new drug, which we'll here call vitamin M? And the reason we're studying it is for the treatment of asthma in humans. Think through how you would design a study. But think through this. What if you were to use the same drug, or vitamin in this case, and how would you create a study when you were investigating its effects in the developing fetus? What would you do? How would you design that project? Think through this. What if it was the same drug, but now you were studying its barriers to use in 5 different populations? Or this. How about how do we study how vitamin M works in the office? How do doctors learn how to use it and develop a competency in prescribing it? And finally, what if we were investigating how doctors effectively teach patients to take this medication? I work through these examples because they really are looking at the same drug and how one can think of an investigation moving from more of a physical science background over to a social science background here on the right of the screen. And this lends itself to understanding a bit more also quantitative approaches or qualitative approaches. On the left, when we think about more of the physical science approach and a quantitative approach to a study, at times it can feel the most logical or the most medical to us because much of the medical literature is grounded in this similar approach. It's very reductionist in nature, but it can also leave you wondering about the big picture or the meaning of the conclusion in the real world. But here on the right, as we talk about the type of study that moves more into the social science world, it's more of a qualitative approach. And we acknowledge at times this seems a little bit nebulous, sometimes not an exacting answer. But it's much more holistic and integrative in nature. At times leave you wondering if the answer is reproducible, transferable, or correct, but it also is much more applicable at times to the real world. It's also important to note that nothing is all or none, and you can at times use both of these when you pursue a medical education research project. So as we think about medical education research, the quantitative approach is one that is more concerned about discovering facts, and more concerned about social phenomenon. It assumes a fixed and measured reality. Data are collected through measuring things, and usually it's dealing with numerical comparisons or that data are reported through statistical analyses. The qualitative approach is different. We're going to be concerned with understanding human behavior from the informant's perspective. We're going to assume a dynamic and negotiated reality. And the data are collected really through participant observation and through interviews. They're analyzed by themes or descriptions. The data are reported in the language of the informant. So really different approaches. Some people will say that the quantitative approach is much more what, when, and where, but the qualitative approach is much more how and why. Some people will say quantitative approaches are hypothesis testing. We have a hypothesis, let's determine if it's true or not. But a qualitative approach is more hypothesis generating. We take an observation, we develop a theme, and we wonder what is behind that or why did that happen. So let's move forward to be a bit more practical now as you think about a potential medical education research project and talk through the two different approaches. And we're going to ground it by answering these three questions. For each of the different approaches, let's talk through how do you collect data for an effective project, how do you analyze that data, and then what does the data tell you. I'll first talk about the quantitative approach to medical education research, and Dr. Gaviola will then speak about the qualitative approach. So we'll take these questions one at a time, beginning first with the quantitative approach to research. How do you collect data using a quantitative approach? Well, it's very reductionist to find something that you can measure accurately, precisely, or reliably. Like, is the student coming to class? Yes or no? It's almost always a numerical-based approach, and there's a very much a linear mindset. There's a rank order. And your variable that you're studying influences something and has a downstream effect. When we think about a quantitative approach to medical education research, we also seek usually big numbers. We still seek multi-center approaches. We like prospective collection of data. All of these would be favored and would make your quantitative approach more valuable. Here's an example of one quantitative approach to research. This was a very important article published over a decade ago in the New England Journal, and it looked at disciplinary action taken by medical boards and linked it to prior behavior in medical school. Now, when one thinks about behavior or professionalism issues, that sounds like a very qualitative thing to measure. But let's look at what the authors did. They first performed a case control study of 235 medical school graduates from 3 separate medical schools, and these 235 students were disciplined by state boards. They searched the public records of the discipline of all the graduates, and then they went back to the medical schools where these individuals came from and reviewed the records. And what you're going to note here is that they took a very qualitative endpoint, which is professional or adverse behavior, and tried to make it into a qualitative measurable variable. They had 2 reviewers who assessed each finding from these old medical school records. They assigned a severity rating to what they saw. Either there was no professionalism issue, a trace, there was a concern, a problem, or it was extreme. But then they tried to make it very quantitative, so they dichotomized the rating. They said if there was a concern, a problem, or it was extreme, that was deemed unprofessional, whereas the other 2 categories were deemed not unprofessional. That allowed them then to produce tables like this. You can see the 2 columns. One is the disciplined physicians and the other are the controls. And then they looked at overall what were the behaviors, and you can see they ranked them as 1 to twice or greater than 3 times, and were able to provide some calculations as to how often these happened later in life to those who were disciplined in medical school versus those who were not. So it becomes a very quantitative medical education research publication and powerful enough to be published in the New England Journal. Let's work through the second question, which is with a quantitative approach, how do you analyze the data? First is, we usually are very descriptive. We'll talk about the distribution of what we see. We'll create histograms. We'll talk about means, medians, and ranges. This is a very common way of dealing with numbers. And of course, we'll compare, because usually there's an intervention, or there's 2 separate groups, or there's a before or after change. And you'll often see that we'll use statistics. It will feel more biomedical to you, because this is often how a new drug is tested. Is there a categorical endpoint, yes or no? And if so, we typically use a chi-squared analysis. Is there a continuous variable, such as age, in which case we'd use a test similar to a student's t-test? Or if there's differences in averages over time at multiple points, we'd often use the analysis of the variance, or ANOVA. Here's an example of one way of how we analyze the data. This is a publication here from the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Osman is the lead author. And this was a study that really took a background here that teaching of medical students is often one-on-one. It's felt to be an apprenticeship model. It's the backbone of our education, that an older individual, such as an attending, teaches a medical student. But increasingly, this one-on-one model breaks down a little bit, at least in terms of continuity. And that was the hypothesis that led to this research study, that we noticed that attendings, residents, and students were all rotating in 2-week shifts, but they were offset. So we wondered just how many days do students spend on average with their resident or attending before they have a new teacher to work with? And also, how many different supervising residents then, or attendings, would a single student have, often over a 4-week experience? So Dr. Osman went back and studied all of the experiences of her students over a several-year period. And this is a simple way of displaying the data. On this figure here on the x-axis, you see the total number of supervising physicians that a single student had during a 4-week block. And then you see on the y-axis the number of students over this 3-year period. And you can see it's simply a histogram, but it shows a lot of important data. That on average in 4 weeks, most students had 3 attending physicians, which is found here in the blue bars, whereas most commonly students experienced either 2 or 4 resident physicians, so a lot of turnover. Here's a second figure from the same article. On the x-axis here, it's simply the length of interaction. How many days total together do the students spend with your average supervisor, either a resident or an attending? And you will see here that on average 5 days was the most common, also then 12 days the second most common. This was very powerful and was able to be published in the journal Teaching and Learning in Medicine. And finally, when one thinks with quantitative approaches, what do the data tell you? Well, the good news here is that a quantitative approach can often appear more precise, and therefore some think it is even more important on the size, quantity, cost, time, etc. of your intervention and of the group you're studying. It also gives you a numerical understanding of group differences and also quantitative changes over time. When one thinks about accuracy, the answer is sometimes yes or sometimes no. Some variables that are studied with a clear endpoint do give you meaningful information upon which to change, but other times the endpoint has to be put into the context of the broader educational environment, and that's where a quantitative approach does not tell the whole picture. And that gets to meaning. Questions like, why did the students not learn what you were teaching them? Well, that's hard to at times determine simply from a quantitative approach. Or what were the student groups thinking during your session? Well, that's very hard to get to with a quantitative approach. How did they approach the problem differently the next time? Well, we would not know that because a quantitative approach was studying simply one moment in time. Those are the limitations that we often encounter. Here's one more study just to mention that takes a very quantitative approach, but yet doesn't necessarily tell us the whole picture, and again speaks to one of the limitations of quantitative analysis in medical education. This is a separate New England Journal article published by Chris Landegren and colleagues that looked at the effects of reducing interns' work hours upon serious medical errors in the intensive care units. And the follow-up, of course, is it was a series of these studies that led to significant changes in resident total work hour limitations in the graduate medical education world. And they asked, do long work hours lead to patient harm? And you see here 2 columns, the traditional schedule when residents were in the hospital a bit longer, and then an intervention where there was more ability and greater ability for rest. And you can see then on the y-axis the number of medical errors showing a reduction with the intervention. That would clearly lead one to say that people should be put on the intervention schedule because it reduces harm to patients. But a follow-up study, which was just published in 2016, asked, though, if sticking to that unique work hour limit, could a more flexible work hour policy be just as safe for patient care? And here the authors were able to show that indeed there was non-inferiority between the adjusted schedule versus the unadjusted schedule. And what we're saying here is that the quantitative approach provided some very important data demonstrating that errors and harm could be reduced, but you can see also that the first study did not show how work hours could also be adapted to at times allow for a better fit into a work and teaching environment. With that, I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Gaviola, who's going to discuss qualitative approaches to medical education research and answer these three questions.